Sometimes a man's heart breaks so completely that only another broken soul can understand the pain. In 1883, on the dusty edge of Deadwood, that's what happened when Eli Boone saw the stallion that saved his life. The massive horse stood in the auction ring, wild with rage and branded as a killer. Whispers called it cursed, untamable, impossible to break. But when the cowboy stepped forward and bellowed, "He's coming with me," he wasn't there to tame, he was there to save it. Years ago, this stallion rescued Eli from a mining stampede, then vanished. Now widowed and land poor, Eli sees the horse as his last connection to who he once was. But can a broken man heal a broken animal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Deadwood's main street, painting the wooden storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Dust motes danced in the early light, stirred by the occasional wagon wheel or boot heel against the weathered planks. The town was waking up slowly, like an old man stretching his joints after a long night's sleep. Eli Boone sat on the steps of Swearingen's saloon, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His weathered hands wrapped around the tin cup like he was holding on to something precious, though anyone looking could see the coffee was bitter and black as tar. At 53, Eli carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to be careful with his body, not from age, but from the weight of too many memories. His clothes told a story of their own. Work pants patched at the knees, a shirt that had once been white but now bore the permanent stains of honest labor, and boots that had walked more miles than most men could count. The hat on his head was shaped by years of rain and sun. Its brim curled just so to keep the worst of the weather out of his eyes. "Morning, Eli?" came a familiar voice from behind him. Doc Henley emerged from the saloon, medical bag in one hand and a steaming cup in the other. The doctor was one of the few men in Deadwood who still bothered with pleasantries when it came to Eli Boone. Most folks had learned to keep their distance, not out of fear, but out of that peculiar discomfort people feel around grief that's gone on too long. "Doc," Eli nodded without looking up. "Does someone need patching up already?" Mrs. Patterson's youngest fell out of the hayloft again. Henley settled beside Eli on the steps, his own knees creaking in protest. "That boy's going to give me more business than the Saturday night crowd." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the town come alive. The blacksmith's hammer had already started its rhythmic song, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery across the street. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. "Heard there's going to be quite the spectacle at today's auction," Doc said carefully. Eli's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his cup. "That's so." "Horse came in yesterday evening on the rail car from Cheyenne. Biggest stallion anyone's seen in these parts. Black as midnight and twice as mean from what they're saying." The mention of the horse stirred something in Eli's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that showing too much interest in anything just gave people more reason to pity him, or worse, to try to help. "Folks saying he killed a man down in Colorado," Doc continued. "Trampled him to death for trying to break him." Eli finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting the doctor's concerned gaze. "You believe everything you hear, Doc?" "I believe some animals carry their own kind of pain, same as people do." Henley stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Sometimes that pain makes them dangerous. Sometimes it just makes them misunderstood." After the doctor left, Eli remained on the steps, thinking about horses and pain and the peculiar way life had of bringing things back around when you least expected it. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. The mining certificate was dated 5 years ago, back when he'd been a different man with different dreams. The document bore the official seal of the Arizona Territory Mining Commission, certifying Eli Boone's legal claim to a silver mine 30 miles south of Tucson. The ink had faded, and one corner was torn where he'd folded and unfolded it too many times, but the words were still clear enough to read, clear enough to remember what he'd lost. Martha had been so proud when he'd filed that claim. She'd kissed him right there in the claims office, not caring who saw, her eyes bright with the possibility of a real future together. They'd talked about the house they'd build, the children they'd have, the life they'd make with honest work and silver in the ground. The mine had paid well for 3 years. Well enough for Eli to buy Martha a proper wedding ring. Well enough for them to put money aside for that house she wanted. Well enough for them to feel like maybe they'd finally caught hold of something good in this hard world. Then came the stampede. 15 men dead, the mine collapsed, and everything they'd worked for buried under tons of rock and broken dreams. Eli had survived because of a horse, a big black stallion that had belonged to one of the other miners. The animal had somehow known the mountain was going to come down and had refused to go into the mine that morning. When the ground started shaking, the horse had knocked Eli clear of the entrance just as the whole thing caved in. He'd never seen that horse again after that day. In the chaos and grief that followed, animals had scattered, claims had been abandoned, and Eli had found himself walking away from Arizona with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wife who'd never look at him the same way again. Martha had tried to hide her disappointment, but Eli had seen it in the way she'd stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans that stretched beyond the next month. She died of pneumonia 2 winters later, here in Deadwood, in a rented room above the general store. Her last words had been about the mine, about how they'd been so close to having everything they'd dreamed of. Eli Boone. The voice cut through his memories like a blade. Samuel Wright stood at the bottom of the steps, dressed in his usual fine clothes, and wearing his usual expression of barely contained disdain. Wright owned the largest ranch in the territory and made sure everyone knew it. He was the kind of man who measured his worth by how much land he could put his name on and how many men called him boss. Right. Eli folded the mining certificate and tucked it back into his pocket. Heard you've been asking around about work again. Mans. Got to eat? Wright stepped closer, his shadow falling across Eli's face. I might have something for you. My regular hands are busy with the roundup, but I need someone to muck out the stables. $2 for the week, meals included. $2 was insulting money, and they both knew it. Wright was offering charity disguised as work, the kind of gesture that was supposed to make the giver feel generous and the receiver feel grateful. Eli had swallowed his pride enough times to know how this dance went. Appreciate the offer, Eli said carefully, but I've got other plans today. The auction? Wright's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. Planning to buy yourself a plow horse with money you don't have? Eli stood slowly, his full height putting him eye to eye with the rancher. Planning to see what's for sale? Wright's expression darkened. Don't get ideas above your station, Boone. That horse they're bringing in isn't for men like you. That's a stallion worth real money, the kind of animal that could improve a man's breeding stock for generations. Guess we'll see. Guess we will. Wright turned to leave, then paused. Word of advice, Eli, stop living in the past. That mine certificate you keep carrying around isn't worth the paper it's printed on anymore. Time to accept what you are now instead of what you used to be. After Wright walked away, Eli remained standing on the steps, his jaw tight and his hands clenched. The rancher wasn't wrong about the certificate. It was worthless now. But it was the only thing Eli had left that connected him to the man he'd been when Martha was alive, when they'd had dreams worth fighting for. The auction would start in 3 hours. Eli had $17 to his name, not enough to buy a decent saddle, let alone a prize stallion. But something in his chest told him he needed to be there anyway, needed to see this horse that had the whole town talking. Mayor Caldwell appeared around the corner, his considerable belly preceding him down the street. The mayor was a political creature who survived by keeping everyone just happy enough to vote for him come election time. He spotted Eli and changed direction, his expression shifting to that particular mix of concern and wariness that most folks wore when they had to deal with the town's most notable widower. Eli, good to see you up and about early, Caldwell said, though his tone suggested it wasn't particularly good at all. Trust you'll be keeping things peaceful at the auction today? Last thing we need is any disturbances. Planning to buy a horse, not start a war, Eli replied. Good, good. Just remember, this is a respectable event. Buyers coming in from 3 counties to see that stallion. Important people, if you catch my meaning." Eli caught the meaning just fine. Important people with important money, and Eli Boone wasn't either of those things. The message was clear. Look but don't touch, watch but don't participate. The morning wore on with its familiar rhythm. Eli walked the length of Main Street twice, stopping to help old Henrik load feed sacks onto his wagon and accepting a biscuit from Mrs. Chen at the bakery. Small kindnesses from people who remembered when he'd been worth remembering, back when he'd had money in his pocket and hope in his eyes. By noon, wagons and riders were arriving for the auction. Eli positioned himself near the back of the crowd that was gathering around the livestock pens behind Peterson's feed store. The air hummed with anticipation and the kind of excitement that comes when people smell the possibility of witnessing something extraordinary. And then they brought out the horse. The crowd went dead silent when they led the stallion into the ring. Eli had seen big horses before, draft, animals that could pull a loaded wagon through mud, cavalry mounts that could carry a man and his gear across desert country. But this animal was something else entirely. The stallion stood nearly 18 hands high, his coat so black it seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight. Every muscle in his frame was defined like carved stone, and his neck arched with the kind of pride that couldn't be beaten out of any living thing. But it was the eyes that stopped Eli's breath in his throat. Dark, intelligent, and filled with a rage that came from deep wounds and deeper betrayals. The horse's nostrils flared as he scanned the crowd, ears pinned back, ready to fight anything that moved wrong. "Lord Almighty," someone whispered behind Eli. "That ain't no horse. That's a demon." The auctioneer, a thin man named Parsons, who'd been selling livestock in these parts for 20 years, looked nervous as he climbed onto his platform. His usual easy patter seemed to stick in his throat as he glanced at the animal. "Gentlemen," Parsons began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd, "we have here a truly exceptional animal. 5-year-old stallion, bloodlines traced back to Kentucky racing stock. Strong, healthy, and—" The horse reared without warning, his hooves striking air as he let out a sound that was part whinny, part roar. The 2 men holding his lead rope stumbled backward, barely keeping their footing. The crowd pressed back as one, boots shuffling in the dirt. "Spirited," Parsons finished weakly. Wright pushed through the crowd to get a better look, his face intent with the kind of hunger that came from seeing something valuable. "What's his breeding history?" he called out. "Well, now," Parsons shuffled through his papers, "says here he was owned by a mining operation down in Arizona. Belonged to a fellow named Martinez, worked the claims south of Tucson. After Martinez died in a cave-in, the horse went wild. Took 6 men to catch him and get him on the rail car." Eli's hand moved instinctively to his vest pocket, where he could feel the outline of something small and hard, a twisted piece of metal he'd carried for 3 years. It was a horseshoe, bent and misshapen from being stepped on and kicked around, but he'd kept it because it had come from the horse that saved his life. The horse that had knocked him clear of the mine entrance, just before the mountain came. Down Martinez, Eli remembered him, a quiet man with calloused hands and a way with animals that had made him popular around the camp. He'd loved that black stallion, talked about him like he was family. Called him Thunder because of the way his hooves sounded when he ran. The horse in the ring turned his head, and for one impossible moment his eyes locked with Eli's across 30 feet of dusty ground and a dozen other men. Recognition flickered there, faint, uncertain, but real. The stallion's ears came forward slightly, his head tilting, as if he was trying to place a half-remembered scent or voice. "Bidding starts at $50, Parsons announced. "Do I hear 50? Wright's hand shot up immediately. 50. 60, called a man in a fine coat who'd ridden in from the county seat. 75, Wright countered, his voice sharp with determination. Eli watched the bidding climb. 100, 125, 150. Each number was more money than he'd seen in a month, more than he could make in a season of odd jobs and handouts. The horse, Thunder, if it really was him, stood in the center of it all like he understood exactly what was happening, his dark eyes moving from face to face with something that looked almost like contempt. $200, Wright declared, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. 200 and I'll take him as is. The silence stretched out like a held breath. $200 was serious money, the kind that made men think twice before throwing it around. The gentleman from the county seat shook his head and stepped back. A few other bidders shifted uncomfortably, but didn't raise their hands. 200 going once, Parsons called. Twice? He's coming with me. The words left Eli's mouth before he'd made a conscious decision to speak. They rolled across the crowd like thunder, deep and certain and final. Every head turned toward him, and he could feel the weight of their stares, the mix of surprise and concern and barely contained laughter. Wright spun around, his face flushing red. What did you say? Eli stepped forward, pushing through the crowd until he reached the front of the ring. The stallion's eyes tracked his movement, ears still forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Eli's scent. I said he's coming with me. Eli's voice was steady, matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather or the price of grain. The laughter started then, a ripple of amusement that spread through the crowd. Someone called out, "With what money, Boone?" Another voice added, "Maybe he's planning to pay with that worthless mine paper he carries around." But Wright wasn't laughing. His eyes were narrow and calculating as he studied Eli's face. "You don't have $200. No, Eli agreed. I don't. Then what exactly are you doing? Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the twisted horseshoe, holding it up where everyone could see. It looked like nothing special, just a piece of scrap metal, bent and discolored. But when Thunder saw it, his entire demeanor changed. The rage in his eyes softened, his ears came fully forward, and he took a step toward the edge of the ring. "I'm claiming what's mine," Eli said quietly. The crowd had gone silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Confused, uncertain, like people watching something they didn't understand but couldn't look away from. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Wright snarled. Parsons finished the auction. $200, cash money. "Now hold on a minute," came a new voice from the back of the crowd. Doc Henley pushed forward, his medical bag in one hand and a worn leather wallet in the other. "Seems to me there might be more to this story than meets the eye." "What are you doing, Doc?" Wright demanded. Henley ignored him, his attention focused on Eli. "That piece of metal, where'd you get it?" "Arizona," Eli replied. "From this horse's front hoof, the day he saved my life." The doctor studied Eli's face for a long moment, then looked at the stallion, who was still watching Eli with those intelligent dark eyes. Something in the animal's posture had changed. The wildness was still there, but underneath it was something else. Recognition, memory. "How much money do you have, Eli?" Doc asked quietly. $17. "And how much do you think this horse is worth?" Eli looked at Thunder, at the proud arch of his neck, the power in his frame, the intelligence that burned in his eyes like a flame that couldn't be snuffed out. "More than I can afford," he said honestly. "But sometimes a man's got to reach for something even when he knows he can't quite grasp it." Doc Henley nodded slowly, then opened his wallet and counted out bills. "I've got $183, he announced to the crowd. "Saved up for a new medical bag and some equipment from back east. But I think maybe this is more important." He handed the money to Eli, his eyes serious and kind. "Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you can." Wright's face had gone from red to purple. "This is insane. That animal is dangerous. He killed a man." "No," Eli said firmly, still looking at Thunder. "He didn't kill anyone. He protected someone, same as he protected me. There's a difference between killing and defending, Wright. Maybe you'd understand that if you'd ever had something worth defending." Parsons looked around the crowd uncertainly, his gaze moving from Wright's furious face to the money in Eli's hands, to the horse that was now standing completely still, his attention fixed on the man who'd recognized him after 3 years apart. $200, Eli said clearly. "Cash money." The auctioneer's hammer came down with a sound like a gunshot. "Sold to Eli Boone." As the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in amazement, others muttering about fools and their money. Thunder stepped forward until his muzzle was almost touching the rope barrier. He lowered his great head slightly, a gesture that could have been mistaken for submission but wasn't. It was acknowledgement, recognition, a greeting between old friends who'd found each other again after traveling separate roads through the darkness. Eli reached out slowly and touched the horse's nose with the tips of his fingers. Thunder didn't flinch or pull away. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes holding Eli's, and for the first time in 3 years, Eli Boone felt something in his chest that wasn't grief or regret or the hollow ache of things lost. He felt hope. Leading Thunder away from the auction ring felt like trying to guide a storm cloud. The stallion followed willingly enough, but his massive presence seemed to charge the very air around them. People stepped aside as they passed, some out of fear, others out of simple respect, for the sheer power that radiated from the animal. Doc Henley had offered the use of his property, a small plot behind his office with a lean-to that had once housed his own horse before age and arthritis had forced him to rely on borrowing rides when he needed them. It wasn't much, but it was private and far enough from the main street that Thunder wouldn't be a spectacle for every curious passerby. Eli spent the first hour just standing with the horse, letting him get accustomed to the new surroundings. Thunder explored the small enclosure with cautious intelligence, testing the fence posts with his teeth, pawing at the ground, marking the territory as his own. He was still wild, still wary, but the rage that had filled his eyes at the auction had settled into something more manageable, a deep wariness born of hard experience. "Easy there, boy," Eli murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound, and he turned to study Eli with those dark, knowing eyes. There was recognition there, but also confusion. 3 years was a long time for an animal, and Eli knew he'd changed, thinner now, more weathered, carrying grief like a visible weight on his shoulders. Eli reached into his vest pocket and pulled out Martha's wedding ring, a simple gold band that caught the late afternoon sunlight. He'd been carrying it since the day she died, unable to bear putting it away, but unwilling to sell it, even when money had been tightest. Sometimes he took it out just to remember what her hand had felt like in his, how she'd laughed when he'd first slipped it onto her finger. Thunder watched the glint of gold with interest, stepping closer to investigate. Eli held perfectly still as the stallion's muzzle brushed against his hand, warm breath stirring across his palm. For a moment, they stood connected by nothing more than curiosity and the faint memory of shared survival. "You remember, don't you?" Eli whispered. "That day in Arizona, when the mountain came down. You knew something was wrong before any of us did." The horse nickered softly, a sound that was almost conversational. He'd always been vocal, Eli remembered. Martinez used to say Thunder had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. As the sun began to set, Eli brought water and feed, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to spook the animal. Thunder accepted the water immediately. The journey from Cheyenne had been long and dusty, but he was more cautious about the grain. He sniffed it carefully before taking a tentative bite, then another. "Smart," Eli said approvingly. "Don't trust anything you haven't tested first. That's kept both of us alive this long." The first real challenge came when Eli tried to remove Thunder's halter. The leather was old and poorly fitted, clearly not made for an animal of his size. It had rubbed raw patches on the horse's nose and behind his ears, marks that spoke of rough handling and indifferent care. The moment Eli's hands moved toward the buckles, Thunder's demeanor changed. His head shot up, ears pinned back, and he backed away with a snort that was part warning, part fear. The wildness flooded back into his eyes, and Eli could see the memories playing out there, hands that had hurt instead of helped, ropes that had trapped instead of guided. "Whoa there," Eli said, stepping back immediately. "All right, we'll leave it for now." It was the same pattern Martha had used with injured animals they'd found around their little homestead. Birds with broken wings, a fox with its leg caught in a trap, a half-wild dog that had shown up one winter more dead than alive. Patience first, trust second, progress when the animal was ready and not a moment before. Eli settled himself on an overturned crate about 10 feet away from Thunder and simply waited. The horse watched him warily for the first few minutes, then gradually relaxed, as it became clear that no demands were being made. Eli pulled out a piece of jerky from his pocket and chewed it slowly, making no sudden movements. Martha always said animals could sense a person's intentions, he said conversationally. Said they knew the difference between someone who wanted to help and someone who just wanted to control. I always figured she was right about that. She was right about most things. Thunder's ears came forward slightly, responding to the gentle tone, even if he couldn't understand the words. He took a step closer, then another, until he was near enough that Eli could see the intelligent calculation in his eyes. She would have liked you, Eli continued. She had a way with difficult creatures. Said the ones that had been hurt the worst just needed more time to remember that not all hands were hard hands. As if testing this theory, Thunder stretched his neck forward, just close enough that Eli could touch his nose if he chose to. Eli stayed perfectly still, letting the horse make the decision. After a long moment, Thunder brushed his muzzle against Eli's outstretched palm, a gesture so gentle it was almost a question. "That's it," Eli breathed. "That's exactly right." They stayed that way as the light faded, man and horse connected by the simple act of trust offered and accepted. It wasn't much, just a touch, a moment of contact, but it felt like a foundation, the first stone laid for something that might grow into real partnership. Doc Henley appeared at the fence just as full darkness settled over the town. He carried a lantern in one hand and what looked like a bottle in the other. "How's he settling in?" the doctor asked quietly. "Better than I expected," Eli replied, slowly standing so as not to startle Thunder. "He remembers me, I think. Or at least he remembers that I'm not someone who hurt him. That's more than most folks can manage with their own neighbors," Doc observed. "You eaten anything today besides that biscuit from Mrs. Chen?" Eli realized he hadn't thought about food since morning, too focused on Thunder to notice his own hunger. The doctor held up the bottle, whiskey, and from the look of it, and a wrapped bundle that probably contained supper, figured you might need some sustenance if you're planning to camp out here tonight. "Don't know that I'm camping," Eli said, though he hadn't actually considered where he was going to sleep. His room at the boarding house was barely big enough for one person, and leaving Thunder alone on his first night seemed wrong. Horse like that. "In a new place, might appreciate some company," Doc suggested. "Besides, half the town's probably curious enough to come take a look, and I'd rather they found you here to discourage any foolishness." They shared the bottle and the cold chicken Doc had brought, talking quietly while Thunder dozed near the back of the enclosure. The stallion's ears remained alert even in sleep, tracking every sound, ready to wake at the first sign of danger. "Wright came by my office earlier," Doc mentioned casually, "asking questions about where you got the money for the bid. What did you tell him?" "Told him it wasn't any of his business where a man gets his funds, long as they're legally come by." Doc took a sip of whiskey and passed the bottle back. "But he's not going to let this go, Eli. He had his heart set on that horse, and Samuel Wright doesn't take kindly to being outbid by someone he considers beneath him." Eli nodded, unsurprised. Wright was the kind of man who measured his worth by what he owned and how much others envied him. Being beaten by the town's most notable failure would sting worse than losing the money. "Let him be upset," Eli said finally. "That horse didn't belong to him anyway." "No," Doc agreed, watching Thunder's silhouette in the moonlight. "Don't suppose he did." By the third day, Eli had managed to remove Thunder's ill-fitting halter and replace it with a rope lead that sat more comfortably around the stallion's massive head. The raw patches were healing, and Thunder had stopped flinching every time Eli moved his hands near the horse's face. It was progress, but it came with a price. Every morning brought a small crowd of curious onlookers who gathered at Doc Henley's fence to gawk at the killer horse and the fool who thought he could tame it. Most were harmless townspeople, with nothing better to do than watch their neighbor make what they assumed would be a spectacular failure of himself, but some of the watchers weren't so benign. Eli first noticed Wright's men on the morning of the fourth day. Two of them standing across the street from Doc's property, trying to look casual while they studied every detail of the makeshift stable. They weren't local boys. These were hired hands from Wright's spread, men with hard eyes and the kind of stillness that came from being comfortable with violence. Company, Doc observed. He coming up behind Eli with his morning coffee? Seemed so. Thunder had noticed them too. The stallion's head was high, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. Horses had a sense about dangerous men, same as they did about storms and predators. Thunder's posture said he was ready to fight or run, whichever proved necessary. Want me to have a word with them? Doc asked. Not yet, Eli replied. Long as they stay on the other side of the street, they're just watching. Watching's not a crime, but it was unsettling, and it got worse as the day wore on. The two men were joined by a third around noon, then a fourth in the afternoon. They made no move to approach, but their presence was like a weight in the air, a constant reminder that Wright's interest in Thunder hadn't diminished with losing the auction. Eli tried to focus on the horse, on the slow process of rebuilding trust between them. He'd found a yellowed newspaper clipping in his coat pocket, an article about the mining disaster that had taken Martinez and 14 other men. Reading it again brought back the smell of dust and dynamite, the sound of men shouting warnings that came too late. The article mentioned Thunder by name, describing how the Stallion had refused to enter the mine on the morning of the collapse, how he'd knocked 2 men clear of the entrance before the mountain came down. The reporter had called it animal instinct, but Eli knew better. Thunder hadn't acted on instinct, he'd acted on intelligence, on an understanding that went deeper than mere survival. You saved more than just me that day, Eli murmured, holding the clipping where Thunder could see it. The horse seemed to recognize the scent of old newsprint, perhaps remembering the reporters who'd swarmed the mining camp in the aftermath of the disaster. Thunder's response surprised him. The Stallion stepped forward and very gently took the edge of the newspaper between his teeth, not tearing it, but holding it as carefully as a mother cat carrying a kitten. For a moment they stood connected by that fragile link, man and horse, both remembering a day when the world had ended and begun again. Touching scene. The voice came from directly behind them. Smooth and mocking, Eli turned to find Wright standing just outside the enclosure, having approached while Eli's attention was focused on Thunder. The rancher's men flanked him, their hands resting casually near their gun belts. Afternoon, Wright, Eli said calmly, not moving away from Thunder's side. Thought I'd come see how you're managing with your purchase. Wright's eyes never left the Stallion, and there was hunger there, naked and unashamed. Magnificent animal. Shame to see him wasted on someone who doesn't understand his true potential. Thunder's reaction was immediate and violent. The moment Wright spoke, the horse's ears pinned back flat against his skull, his lips pulled back to show teeth, and a sound like distant thunder rumbled from deep in his chest. It wasn't fear, it was recognition and rage. Easy, boy, Eli said softly, his hand moving to Thunder's neck. The horse's muscles were coiled tight as spring steel, ready to explode into action. Wright noticed the reaction and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Interesting, almost like he knows me. Should he? Eli asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. I do a lot of business down in Arizona territory. Mining claims, cattle operations, land deals. Sometimes those deals require persuasion. Wright's smile widened. Martinez was a stubborn man, refused several very generous offers for his claim, said he'd rather die than sell to me. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thunder's rage, his reputation as a killer, the way he'd gone wild after Martinez's death, it all made sense now. Wright hadn't just been involved in the violence that had scattered Thunder from the mining camp. He'd been the cause of it. You son of a... Careful, Boone. Wright's voice carried a warning. That's a serious accusation you're about to make. Might be wise to think about whether you can back it up. Eli looked at the men flanking Wright, then at Thunder's obvious distress, and made a decision. Think I'll keep my thoughts to myself for now. Smart man. Wright tipped his hat mockingly. Tell you what, though, I'm still interested in buying that horse. $500 cash money. That's more than twice what you paid for him. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Boone. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Wright's expression hardened, or the right motivation. After Wright and his men left, Eli spent an hour just standing with Thunder, letting the horse's anger gradually subside. The stallion's muscles remained tense, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds from the street. But the initial fury had banked down to a steady, watchful alertness. "So that's how it is," Eli said quietly. "He hurt you, didn't he? Or hurt someone you cared about?" Thunder pressed his forehead against Eli's chest, a gesture that spoke of trust and shared understanding. They'd both lost someone to Samuel Wright's ambition. They'd both been left alone to carry grief that was too heavy for one soul to bear. As evening fell, Doc Henley brought supper and news from town. "Wright's been asking questions," he reported. "About your finances, about where you're planning to keep that horse, about whether you can really afford to feed him. And what are people telling him? Truth mostly. That you're land poor and cash poor and probably shouldn't have bought an animal you can't afford to keep." Doc handed Eli a plate of beans and cornbread. "But some folks are starting to talk about other things too. About how that horse responds to you, how different he seems when you're around. Different how? Calmer. More human, if that makes sense. Mrs. Patterson said it was like watching two old friends find each other again after a long separation." Eli considered this while he ate. Thunder had indeed become calmer over the past few days, more willing to accept touch, more responsive to voice commands. The wildness was still there, but it was controlled now, focused, like a weapon held in careful hands. "Wright's not going to give up," Doc continued. "He wants that horse, and he's not the kind of man who accepts being told no." "Then he's going to learn something new about himself," Eli replied. "Because Thunder's not going anywhere." Thunder nickered softly, as if agreeing with the sentiment. His dark eyes held the light of the lantern like stars, bright with intelligence and purpose. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The Apache arrowhead had been a gift from Running Bear, a Chiricahua tracker who'd worked the mining camps when the silver was flowing, and men still believed the mountains held enough treasure to make them all rich. Eli pulled it from his pocket now, running his thumb over the carefully napped obsidian point while Thunder dozed in the morning sun. The arrowhead had brought him luck, Running Bear had said. Or maybe it had just reminded him that some bonds between man and beast went deeper than ownership, deeper than breaking and training and all the other words white men used when they talked about horses. "This one knows you," Running Bear had said about Thunder. Back in those days when the mine was still producing and Martinez was still alive, to brush his horse's coat every evening. "Not just your face, not just your voice. He knows your spirit," Eli had laughed at that. Back when he was young enough to think he understood the world, and old enough to believe he was smarter than men who'd lived on this land for 1,000 years before he was born. Now watching Thunder's ears track his every movement even in sleep, he wondered if the Apache tracker had seen something he'd been too blind to notice. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Thunder's head come up sharply. 3 riders were coming down the street at an easy pace, but there was something in their posture that spoke of business rather than pleasure. Thunder's nostrils flared, and Eli could see the tension gathering in the stallion's frame. Mayor Caldwell rode in the lead, his considerable bulk making his horse work harder than it should have. Behind him came Wright, sitting his mount with the easy confidence of a man who'd been born to the saddle. The 3rd rider was a stranger, a lean man in a black coat with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look right through whatever they were pointed at. "Morning." "Eli," Caldwell called out as they drew rein outside the enclosure. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we've got some matters to discuss." "Morning, Mayor." Eli didn't move from Thunder's side. The stallion had gone rigid, his attention fixed on Wright with an intensity that made the air feel electric. "This is Mr. Garrett," Caldwell continued, gesturing to the stranger. "He's a livestock inspector from the territorial government. Got some concerns about that horse of yours." Garrett dismounted with economical movements, his pale eyes never leaving Thunder. "Magnificent animal," he said, his voice carrying an Eastern accent. But I understand there are questions about his temperament. What kind of questions? Eli asked. The kind that arise when an animal has a history of violence. Garrett pulled a folder from his saddlebags and consulted the papers inside. According to reports from Colorado, this stallion killed a man, trampled him to death during an attempted breaking. Reports can be wrong. Can be, yes. But the territorial government takes such matters seriously. Garrett's smile was thin and professional. Animals that pose a danger to public safety must be properly evaluated. If this horse is indeed as dangerous as reported, well, there are procedures for dealing with such situations. Wright spoke for the first time, his voice carrying false concern. Hate to see anyone get hurt, Eli. Maybe it would be better for everyone if that horse was in more experienced hands. Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, hooves striking the air, and let out a sound that was part challenge, part warning. When he came down, he positioned himself squarely between Eli and the three mounted men, his massive frame radiating controlled aggression. Jesus, Caldwell breathed, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. But Eli had seen something different in Thunder's display. The stallion's ears weren't pinned back in rage. They were forward, alert, protective. This wasn't the reaction of an animal driven by mindless violence. This was a horse defending someone he cared about. Easy, Thunder, Eli said quietly, placing his hand on the stallion's neck. The response was immediate. Thunder's muscles relaxed, his breathing slowed, and he lowered his head to nuzzle Eli's shoulder with surprising gentleness. Garrett watched this exchange with calculating eyes. Interesting. The animal seems quite responsive to you. He's not an animal that needs breaking, Eli replied. He needs understanding. Understanding doesn't prevent tragedies, Wright interjected. That horse is a killer, and everyone in this town knows it. No, Eli said firmly, his memory flashing back to that terrible day in Arizona. He's not a killer. He's a protector. The words came with a flood of recollection. Martinez brushing Thunder's coat while he talked about his plans to return to Mexico, about the small farm he wanted to buy with his mining proceeds. Thunder standing guard while Martinez slept, his dark eyes scanning the camp for signs of trouble. The morning of the cave-in, when Thunder had refused to enter the mine, pacing nervously, whinnying warnings that no one had understood until it was too late. Martinez used to say Thunder could sense danger, Eli continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Said the horse had saved his life more than once, warned him away from claims that played out, from men who meant him harm. Touching story, Wright said dryly. But it doesn't change the facts. That horse has blood on his hooves. Whose blood? Eli challenged. What man did he kill and why? For the first time, Wright looked uncomfortable. His eyes shifted away from Eli's direct gaze, and when he spoke again, his voice lacked its usual confidence. Details don't matter. What matters is public safety. But details did matter, and Eli was beginning to understand what they were. Thunder hadn't killed an innocent man. He'd defended himself or Martinez against someone who'd meant them harm. Someone like Wright or one of his hired guns. Garrett seemed to sense the undercurrents in the conversation. Perhaps we should schedule a formal evaluation, he suggested. Bring in an expert who can assess the animal's temperament under controlled conditions. That won't be necessary, came a new voice from behind them. Doc Henley approached on foot, his medical bag in one hand and a thick folder in the other. I've been conducting my own evaluation of this horse for the past week, and I'm prepared to submit a formal report to the territorial authorities. He handed the folder to Garrett, who opened it and began reading with obvious surprise. Dr. Henley, I wasn't aware you had expertise in equine behavior. 20 years of veterinary training before I took up human medicine, Doc replied calmly. And I've been observing this animal closely since Mr. Boone acquired him. My professional opinion is that he poses no danger to the public when properly handled. Wright's face had gone dark with anger. This is ridiculous. You can't evaluate a killer horse by watching him stand in a pen. You're right, Doc agreed. Which is why I've also been researching the circumstances surrounding his supposed violent behavior. He looked directly at Wright. Interesting what you can learn when you start asking the right questions in the right places. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Garrett looked from Doc to Wright to Eli, clearly sensing that there was more to this story than anyone was willing to say outright. "Well," the inspector said finally, closing the folder, "based on Dr. Henley's assessment and my own observations, I see no immediate cause for concern. However, I'll be submitting a report to the territorial office, and there may be follow-up inspections." As the three men prepared to leave, Wright reined his horse close to the fence. "This isn't over, Boone," he said quietly. "That horse should have been mine, and we both know it." "Maybe," Eli replied, "but he's not. And he's not going to be." After they rode away, Doc stayed behind to help Eli brush Thunder's coat. The stallion accepted the grooming with obvious pleasure, his eyes half closed in contentment. "What did you really put in that report?" Eli asked. "The truth," Doc replied, "that this horse shows every sign of intelligence, loyalty, and protective instincts. That his reaction to certain individuals suggests a history of mistreatment rather than inherent violence." He paused in his brushing to look directly at Eli. "And that some men in this territory have a way of making animals dangerous by the way they treat them." Thunder nickered softly, as if agreeing with the assessment. In the afternoon light, with his coat gleaming and his eyes bright with contentment, he looked nothing like the killer horse Wright claimed him to be. He looked like what he'd always been, a loyal companion who'd found his way home. The sewing thimble was silver, tarnished now, but still bearing the delicate pattern of roses that Martha had loved. Eli found it tucked behind a loose board in what had once been their cabin, wrapped in a scrap of the blue fabric she'd been saving to make curtains for their dream house. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Wright and the territorial inspector, and Eli had made a decision that surprised even himself. He was moving Thunder to the abandoned homestead where he and Martha had tried to build their life together. The cabin was in poor condition, roof partially collapsed, windows broken, weeds growing through the floorboards, but the land was his. He bought and paid for with silver from the Arizona mine. "It's not much," he told Thunder as they approached the property on foot, the stallion following on a loose lead rope. "But it's ours." Thunder's ears were alert, taking in the new surroundings with obvious interest. The cabin sat in a small valley, surrounded by hills, thick with pine and aspen, with a stream running clear and cold just 50 yards from the front door. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that made a man understand why people fought wars over land. Martha had loved it here. She'd spent hours planning where they'd plant their garden, where they'd build the barn, how they'd expand the cabin when children came along. Those children had never come, but the dreams had sustained them through 2 hard winters and the back-breaking work of trying to carve a life from wilderness. Wright's offer to buy the place had come 3 days after Martha's funeral, couched in terms of sympathy and practical concern. "Too many memories for a man to bear alone," he'd said. "Might be better to make a fresh start somewhere else." Eli had turned him down then, and again twice more over the following months. Now he understood why Wright had been so persistent. This land, connected to his spread, would give him control of the water rights for the entire valley. Thunder seemed to approve of their new home. He explored the property with the methodical attention of an animal claiming territory, testing the fence posts that still stood, investigating the lean-to that had once housed Martha's chickens, drinking deeply from the stream. The work of making the place livable again would take time Eli wasn't sure he had. Wright's pressure was increasing daily, not direct threats, but a steady campaign of interference. Orders for odd jobs that had been promised to Eli suddenly went to other men. Credit at the general store became harder to secure. Small sabotages appeared around Doc Henley's property, fence rails pulled down, gates left open, supplies mysteriously misplaced. "You could fight him," Doc had suggested the night before. "Take it to the territorial court, file formal complaints." But Eli knew better. Wright had money and influence, connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. A man like Eli Boone, with no property worth speaking of and no political allies, Wouldn't stand a chance in court. Sometimes a man has to find another way, Eli had replied. Now, watching thunder drink from the stream where Martha used to fetch water for washing, Eli wondered if he'd made the right choice. The stallion was thriving. His coat had regained its luster. His eyes were bright with health and contentment, and the wariness that had defined him at the auction was gradually giving way to something approaching peace. But peace was a luxury they might not be able to afford much longer. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his thoughts. 3 men on horseback, moving at an easy pace, but with the deliberate route-finding of people who knew exactly where they were going. Wright's men, Eli realized, here to deliver another message. Thunder's reaction was immediate. His head came up sharply, water still dripping from his muzzle, and every muscle in his frame went tense. A low rumble started deep in his chest, not quite a whinny, not quite a growl, but something that spoke of recognition and barely contained hostility. Easy, boy, Eli murmured, moving to Thunder's side. Let's see what they want. The riders drew rein about 20 yards away, close enough to be clearly heard, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves from the stallion. Their leader was a man Eli didn't recognize. Tall, lean, with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look right through whatever they were pointed at. The same livestock inspector who'd visited the week before, but now wearing different clothes and carrying himself with less official bearing. "Afternoon, Boone," the man called out. "Beautiful property you've got here. Shame to see it going to waste." "It's not going to waste," Eli replied evenly. "Just need some work. Work costs money. Money you don't have." The inspector, or whoever he really was, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mr. Wright sent us to make you another offer. $700 for the land, cash money. That's more than generous for property in this condition. And the horse, what about him?" "Wright wants the horse too. That's what this is really about, isn't it?" The man's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Wright has many interests. Sometimes those interests align with what's best for everyone involved." Thunder took a step forward, placing himself between Eli and the mounted men. His ears were pinned back now, his lips pulled away from his teeth in an expression that needed no translation. The message was clear. "Approach at your own risk, spirited animal," one of the other riders observed. "Might be dangerous for a man living out here alone." "Might be," Eli agreed. "But then again, a man living alone might need a spirited animal to watch his back." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another horse and rider, Doc Henley, moving at a pace that suggested urgency. The doctor's usually calm demeanor was replaced by something approaching agitation. "Eli," he called out as he approached, "we need to talk." The 3 men who'd been pressuring Eli exchanged glances. Their leader touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Think about that offer, Boone. Mr. Wright's patience isn't unlimited." After they rode away, Doc dismounted and walked over to where Eli stood with Thunder. The stallion had calmed somewhat, but his attention remained focused on the direction the men had taken. "What's got you so worked up?" Eli asked. Doc pulled a letter from his coat pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. This came on the afternoon stage. From a lawyer in Tucson. Eli took the letter and read it slowly, his expression growing more puzzled with each line. It was written in the formal language of legal documents, full of whereases and heretofores, but the basic message was clear enough. The estate of one Carlos Martinez, deceased, had been settled after 3 years of legal proceedings. Martinez had died intestate, but evidence had been found indicating his intention to leave his worldly goods to the man who saved his life in the mine collapse. A witness had come forward identifying that man as Eli Boone of Deadwood, Dakota Territory. The estate included a small amount of cash, some personal effects, and one prize stallion known as Thunder. "I don't understand," Eli said slowly. "Martinez died in the cave-in. He couldn't have left anything to anyone." "Read the rest," Doc urged. Eli continued reading, and his blood went cold. Martinez hadn't died in the cave-in. He'd been killed 2 days later, shot in the back while trying to flee with his horse from men who wanted to jump his mine. Witnesses had described the killers as working for a territorial businessman named Samuel Wright. but Martinez had lived long enough to make a statement to a Mexican priest, a statement that had only recently been discovered in church records. In that statement, he described how Eli Boone had saved his life by pulling him from the mine just before it collapsed, and how he wanted to repay that debt by leaving his most prized possession, his horse Thunder, to the man who'd given him extra days of life. Eli's hands were shaking as he finished reading. Thunder seemed to sense his emotional state and moved closer, pressing his warm muzzle against Eli's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Martinez knew he was going to die, Eli said quietly. That's why Thunder was so angry, so wild. He watched his master get murdered, and there was nothing he could do to stop it, and Wright's been trying to cover it up ever since, Doc added. That's why he wants the horse so badly. Thunder's not just valuable breeding stock, he's a witness to murder. The silver thimble felt warm in Eli's pocket, a reminder of Martha's gentle hands and patient heart. She'd always said that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Looking at Thunder, seeing the intelligence and loyalty in those dark eyes, Eli realized that some fights found you whether you wanted them or not. Wright wasn't just trying to steal a horse. He was trying to bury the truth along with it. The silver locket had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth and placed there with the kind of care that spoke of desperate secrecy. Eli found it 3 days after receiving the lawyer's letter, while searching for anything Wright's men might have missed during their obvious searches of the property. Inside the locket was a photograph of Martha, taken shortly after their wedding, her young face bright with hope and possibility. But behind the photograph was something unexpected, a hand-drawn map, carefully folded to fit the small space, showing the location of a cache hidden somewhere in the hills above their old homestead. Martha's handwriting covered the margins of the map in tiny, precise script, for emergencies only. He doesn't know. He'd spent it all trying to make the mine work again. This is for our future, for the children we'll have, for the life we promised each other. Eli's hands shook as he studied the map by lamplight. Martha had hidden money, silver from the look of the symbols she'd drawn, enough to keep them going through hard times, enough to rebuild their life together. She died without telling him, died believing she was protecting their future by keeping this secret. The cache was marked at a place called Crying Rock, about 2 miles up the canyon from their cabin. Eli knew the spot, a distinctive boulder formation where water seeped from the stone year-round, creating dark stains that looked like tears. He and Martha had picnicked there during their first summer together, when everything had seemed possible. Thunder seemed to sense Eli's excitement as they made their way up the canyon the next morning. The stallion moved with eager energy, his ears forward and his nostrils flaring as he explored the familiar territory. This had been Martinez's country too, back when the mines were working and hope was something men could afford to carry. Finding the cache took most of the morning. Martha's map was accurate, but 3 years of weather and growth had changed the landscape enough to make navigation challenging. When Eli finally located the right crevice between 2 granite slabs, his heart was pounding with anticipation and dread. The leather satchel was exactly where Martha's map said it would be, wrapped in canvas and sealed with wax against moisture. Inside were $23 silver, a small bag of silver nuggets from their mine, and a letter addressed to Eli in Martha's careful handwriting. "My dearest husband," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've found yourself in need of what I've hidden here. I pray that day never comes, but if it does, know that this silver represents every penny I could save from our good months, every dollar I could put aside when you weren't watching. I know you would have spent it trying to save the mine, trying to chase the dream that died when the mountain came down. But dreams are precious things, Eli, and sometimes we have to let one dream die so another can be born. This money isn't for the past. It's for whatever future you choose to build. If something has happened to me, don't mourn too long. Find something worth fighting for, and fight with everything you have. I've seen the man you can be when you have something to protect. Be that man again." Eli read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it back in the satchel with the silver. $23 and a bag of nuggets wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to feed Thunder through the winter, enough to buy supplies for rebuilding the cabin, enough to hire a lawyer if Wright's pressure escalated to legal action. But more than that, it was proof that Martha had believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Thunder whinnied softly, and Eli looked up to see the stallion's attention focused on something down the canyon. Riders were approaching, 3 of them, moving fast enough to raise dust. Wright's men from the look of them, and they were heading straight for the cache site. Eli quickly secured the satchel and climbed back down to where Thunder waited. The stallion's posture was tense, alert, ready for trouble. His dark eyes tracked the approaching riders with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential threats. "What do you think, boy?" Eli murmured, his hand resting on Thunder's neck. "Time to go home." But the riders had seen them and were angling to cut off their retreat to the cabin. Wright himself led the group, his face set in the hard lines of a man who'd run out of patience. Behind him rode the 2 men who'd been watching Eli's property for the past week, their hands resting on their gun belts. "Afternoon, Eli," Wright called out as they drew near. "Beautiful day for a ride in the mountains." "Beautiful country," Eli agreed, his voice carefully neutral. "Man could spend all day up here and never get tired of the view." Wright's smile was thin and predatory. "Indeed, though I imagine some views are more interesting than others. Found anything worth looking at?" The question carried weight beyond its casual phrasing. Wright knew about the cache, or suspected its existence. That meant he'd been watching longer than Eli had realized, planning more carefully than anyone had guessed. "Just showing Thunder some new country," Eli replied. "Horse likes to explore. That horse likes a lot of things," Wright observed. "Pity he's gotten attached to someone who can't provide for him properly." Thunder's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The stallion stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Eli and the mounted men, his massive frame radiating controlled hostility. A low rumble started deep in his chest, part warning, part challenge. Wright's horse danced nervously beneath him, responding to Thunder's aggressive posture. "Dangerous animal," Wright said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Might be time to put him down before someone gets hurt." "Only person likely to get hurt is someone who tries to take what isn't his," Eli replied. The standoff stretched out like a held breath. Wright's men were positioned to flank them, but Thunder's presence complicated any direct action. The stallion was bigger and faster than any of their mounts, and his protective instincts toward Eli were obvious to anyone with eyes. "You know what I find interesting?" Wright said conversationally. "How quickly a man's circumstances can change. Yesterday you were broke, living on handouts and charity. Today you seem different, more confident. Like maybe your situation has improved." Wright had been watching, waiting, looking for exactly this kind of change in Eli's behavior. The discovery of Martha's cache wasn't just about money. It was about hope, about the possibility of fighting back. And Wright had seen it in Eli's face, in the way he carried himself. "Sometimes a man just needs to remember who he used to be," Eli said. "And who were you, Eli Boone? Before the mine collapsed, before your wife died, before you became the town drunk." Wright leaned forward in his saddle. "Were you someone who could stand against men like me?" Thunder took another step forward, his hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. His ears were pinned back flat against his skull, his lips pulled away from his teeth in an expression that needed no translation. "I was a territorial marshal for 2 years," Eli said quietly. "Before I took up mining. Before I met Martha." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Wright's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing confidence as he processed this new information. "A marshal," Wright repeated. "That's interesting. Interesting enough that I know the law about claim jumping. About murder. About men who hire guns to solve problems that honest negotiation can't handle." Eli's voice remained calm, conversational, but steel ran underneath it. "Interesting enough that I know how to find witnesses, how to follow evidence, how to build a case that'll hold up in territorial court." One of Wright's men shifted nervously in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Wright snapped, his attention never leaving Eli's face. "You're bluffing. If you had evidence, you'd have used it already, would I?" Eli asked. "Or would I wait until I had enough to make sure it stuck? Make sure all the right people got what was coming to them?" Thunder sensed the rising tension and responded by positioning himself for action. His powerful hindquarters coiled like springs, ready to launch him forward at the first sign of trouble. The other horses were becoming increasingly agitated, their riders struggling to control mounts that wanted nothing more than to flee from the obvious predator in their midst. "This conversation is over," Wright declared, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Enjoy your treasure hunt, Boone. Just remember, some secrets are buried for good reasons." As Wright and his men rode away, Eli remained where he stood, his hand resting on Thunder's neck. The stallion's muscles gradually relaxed, but his attention remained focused on the direction the riders had taken. "He knows," Eli said quietly. "About Martinez, about the murder, about everything. And he knows we know." Thunder nickered softly, a sound that somehow managed to convey both agreement and determination. They'd crossed a line today, Eli realized. Wright was no longer just pressuring him to sell. He was fighting for his freedom, maybe his life, but Martha's letter had reminded Eli of something important. He'd been a different man once, before grief and loss had worn him down to nothing. A man who'd worn a badge and faced down killers, who'd protected the innocent and brought justice to the lawless. Maybe it was time to remember how to be that man again. The Colt .45 revolver had been wrapped in oiled leather and hidden beneath the cabin's foundation, placed there during Eli's brief tenure as a territorial marshal, when enemies were more than theoretical possibilities. He cleaned it methodically by lamplight, checking the action, counting the cartridges in the worn gun belt that went with it. 6 bullets. Enough for what was coming, if he was careful and accurate and lucky. Thunder watched from the doorway of the cabin, his dark eyes tracking every movement as Eli prepared for war. The stallion seemed to understand that something significant was happening, that the careful peace they'd built over the past weeks was about to be shattered. "Wish there was another way," Eli said quietly, more to himself than to the horse. "But some men don't understand anything but force." The revelation of his martial background had changed the dynamic between him and Wright, but not in the way Eli had hoped. Instead of backing down, Wright had escalated. Over the past 3 days, the pressure had increased dramatically. Fences cut, water sources poisoned, supplies stolen. Wright was no longer trying to buy Eli out. He was trying to drive him off his land by any means necessary. Doc Henley had brought word from town that morning. Wright was hiring more men, gunslingers from Colorado and Wyoming, with reputations for solving problems violently. The territorial authorities had been contacted about irregularities in some of Wright's land deals. But investigations moved slowly, and Wright was running out of patience. "He's planning something big," Doc had warned. "Something final. But he's giving you until Sunday to clear out, and then he's coming to collect what he considers his." Sunday was tomorrow. Eli strapped on the gun belt, feeling the familiar weight settle around his hips. It had been 3 years since he'd carried iron, 3 years since he'd been the kind of man who settled disputes with lead instead of words. But some skills, once learned, never fully left a man's bones. Thunder nickered softly, a sound that drew Eli's attention back to the present. The stallion was looking toward the ridge above the cabin, his ears forward and alert. Riders moving carefully through the timber, trying to approach unseen. Wright's scouts, most likely, checking to see if Eli was still on the property or if he'd taken the hint and run. Eli counted at least 4 men, maybe more, positioned to watch the cabin and report back on his movements. "So that's how it is," he murmured, checking his revolver one more time before holstering it. No waiting until Sunday after all. The attack would come tonight, Eli realized. Wright would send his hired guns under cover of darkness, claim Eli had resisted lawful eviction, maybe even suggest the man had gone mad with grief and posed a danger to himself and others. By morning, Eli Boone would be dead. Thunder would belong to Wright. and the truth about Martinez's murder would be buried along with the only witness who could contradict Wright's version of events, unless Eli was ready for them. He spent the afternoon preparing, drawing on skills he'd hoped never to need again. The cabin sat in a natural depression that offered some protection but limited escape routes. The stream provided cover to the east, thick timber to the west, but the north and south approaches were too open for comfort. Thunder would be the key. The Stallion's speed and intelligence could turn the tide if Eli used them correctly. But that meant trusting the horse completely, relying on an animal's instincts in a situation where one mistake would be fatal for both of them. "You remember how to fight, boy?" Eli asked, running his hands along Thunder's powerful neck. "Because I'm going to need everything you've got tonight." Thunder's response was a soft whicker that somehow managed to sound like agreement. The Stallion's ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds from the surrounding forest, alert to any change in the normal rhythm of the mountains. As evening approached, Eli made his final preparations. He moved Thunder to a position near the back of the cabin, where the horse would have clear escape routes in multiple directions. He checked his gun one more time, made sure his spare ammunition was within easy reach, and settled down to wait. Martha's memory seemed especially close in the gathering darkness. He could almost hear her voice, feel her presence in the cabin they'd shared. She'd always been the practical one, the planner, the one who thought 3 moves ahead, while Eli was still figuring out his first move. "What would you do?" he whispered to the empty room. "How would you handle a man like Wright?" The answer came not in words, but in memory. Martha standing up to a claim jumper who'd tried to intimidate them during their first year in Arizona. Her small frame radiating determination as she'd faced down a man twice her size. She'd been afraid Eli had seen it in her eyes, but she'd stood her ground because some things were worth the risk. Thunder was worth the risk. The truth about Martinez was worth the risk. The right to live free on land he'd bought with honest work was worth the risk. The first shot came just after midnight, a muzzle flash from the timber followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet splintered wood from the cabin's front wall, 6 inches to the left of where Eli's head would have been if he'd been standing in the doorway. "Boone!" Wright's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by the mountain air. "Come out and we'll make this quick." Eli didn't answer. Instead, he moved to a window on the cabin's east side and studied the darkness, looking for muzzle flashes, listening for the sound of men moving through the underbrush. At least 6 of them, maybe 8, positioned in a rough semicircle around the cabin. Thunder was pressed against the back wall of the cabin, his massive frame tense with contained energy. The Stallion's nostrils flared constantly, testing the wind for the scent of approaching enemies. "We know you're in there." Another voice, one of Wright's hired guns. "Might as well come out peaceful like. Save everyone some trouble." A second shot shattered another window, followed quickly by a third and fourth from different positions. They were trying to pin him down, keep him inside the cabin while they closed the circle. Standard tactics for this kind of work: surround the target, eliminate escape routes, then move in for the kill. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed Eli Boone was still the broken-down drunk who'd been living on charity and handouts. They didn't know about the territorial marshal who'd faced down desperados and claimed jumpers, who'd learned to think tactically under pressure. Eli waited until the shooting stopped, then made his move. Instead of trying to defend the cabin, he slipped out the back door and whistled softly for Thunder. The Stallion came to him immediately, moving with the silent grace of a predator. "Time to go hunting," Eli whispered. He swung onto Thunder's back without a saddle, gripping the horse's mane with his left hand, while his right rested on the butt of his revolver. Thunder seemed to understand what was needed. The Stallion moved through the darkness like a ghost, his hooves finding silent purchase on rocky ground, his breathing controlled and quiet. The first sentry never saw them coming. He was positioned in a grove of aspens, about 100 yards from the cabin, his attention focused on the building where he expected Eli to make his last stand. Thunder approached from behind, moving so silently that the man's first warning was the cold steel of Eli's gun barrel pressed against the base of his skull. "Drop the rifle," Eli said quietly. "Make a sound and you'll never make another one." The man complied, his hands shaking as he placed his weapon on the ground. Eli used the man's own belt to tie his hands behind his back, then gagged him with his bandana. "Tell Wright he picked the wrong man to threaten," Eli whispered. "If you live through this." The second sentry was 50 yards away, positioned where he could watch the cabin's north approach. Eli and Thunder took him the same way, silent approach, gun to the head, quick disarmament. 2 down, at least 4 to go, but the third sentry heard them coming. He spun around, rifle coming up, mouth opening to shout a warning. Thunder reacted before Eli could draw his gun, rearing up on his hind legs and striking out with hooves that could crush a man's skull. The sentry went down hard, his rifle flying into the darkness. "Now!" Eli shouted, and Thunder launched himself toward the cabin in a thundering charge that sounded like an avalanche in the mountain silence. Wright's remaining men opened fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like deadly fireflies. But shooting at a moving target in darkness was nearly impossible, and Thunder was moving faster than any horse had a right to move. The stallion dodged between trees, leaped fallen logs, and carried Eli toward the heart of the ambush with the fearless aggression of a war horse. Eli's first shot took down the man positioned at the cabin's front corner, a clean hit that dropped him before he could reload. His second shot went wide, but it was enough to make the other gunman dive for cover. "It's him!" Wright's voice, high with surprise and fear. "How did he—" Thunder wheeled around a massive pine and charged straight at Wright's position. The rancher's horse shied away from the oncoming stallion, nearly throwing its rider. Wright fought to control his mount while trying to bring his rifle to bear, but Thunder was too close, too fast. Eli's third shot took Wright in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around in his saddle. The rancher screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching at the wound while his horse bolted into the timber. "This is for Martinez," Eli shouted after him. "And for every man you've murdered." The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer flee wounded, lost their stomach for the fight. They melted back into the forest, leaving their unconscious comrades behind and carrying word of Eli Boone's unexpected resurrection from broken drunk to avenging marshal. As the shooting stopped and quiet returned to the mountains, Eli sat on Thunder's back in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by the evidence of Wright's failed ambush. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt like the man Martha had married. The war wasn't over yet. Wright would be back, probably with even more men. But tonight had proven something important to both sides of this conflict. Eli Boone was no longer running from his past. He was embracing it. Martha's cross necklace caught the first light of dawn as Eli fastened it around his neck, the silver chain cold against his skin. She'd worn it every day of their marriage, a simple symbol of faith that had somehow survived the collapse of everything else they'd built together. "Watch over us today," he whispered to her memory, then turned his attention to the approaching sound of hoofbeats. Wright was coming back, and he wasn't alone. Eli counted at least a dozen riders cresting the ridge above his cabin, their silhouettes dark against the lightening sky. Wright rode at their head, his left arm in a makeshift sling, but his spine straight with determination. Behind him came professional gunmen, the kind of hard cases who solve problems with lead and ask questions later. Thunder stood beside Eli in the clearing, his massive frame radiating controlled aggression. The stallion's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of approaching enemies. He remembered Wright's smell, remembered the man who'd been responsible for Martinez's death. Last chance, Boone. Wright's voice carried across the distance between them. "Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." Eli's response was to draw his revolver and check the cylinder one final time. 6 bullets against 12 men. Not good odds by any measure, but he'd faced worse during his marshal days. Sometimes it wasn't about having enough ammunition. Sometimes it was about making every shot count. "Come and take it," he shouted back. Wright's men spread out in a wide line, moving to surround the cabin and cut off any escape routes. They were professionals. Eli could see that in the way they positioned themselves, the careful attention they paid to fields of fire and mutual support. This wouldn't be like the clumsy ambush attempt of the night before, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They were treating this like a conventional gunfight, expecting Eli to hole up in the cabin and make his last stand behind wooden walls. They weren't prepared for what thunder represented, a four-legged advantage that could change the entire nature of the battle. "You ready for this, boy?" Eli murmured, his hand resting on Thunder's neck. The stallion's response was to lower his head slightly and paw the ground with one massive hoof. It was the same gesture he'd made in the auction ring before Eli had claimed him. A statement of readiness, of partnership, of shared determination. The first shots came from the tree line, aimed high to drive Eli into cover. Wright's men were being cautious, not wanting to risk themselves unnecessarily against a man who'd already proven more dangerous than expected. They would try to wear him down, force him to exhaust his ammunition, then move in for the kill. Instead of diving for cover, Eli swung onto Thunder's back and spurred the stallion toward the nearest group of gunmen. Thunder responded with explosive power, his hooves eating up ground at a pace that turned careful tactical positioning into desperate scrambling. The first gunman tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Thunder was on him before he could sight properly. The stallion's shoulder struck the man's horse with the force of a battering ram, sending both animal and rider tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and leather. Eli's first shot took down the second gunman before he could recover from his surprise. His second shot scattered the remaining men in that group, sending them diving for whatever cover they could find. Thunder wheeled around, responding to Eli's knee pressure, and charged toward the next position. The stallion seemed to understand the tactical situation intuitively, using his speed and mass to disrupt Wright's carefully planned assault. "Stop him!" Wright screamed from his position near the cabin. "Bring down that horse!" But shooting at a moving target while under attack was nearly impossible, especially when that target was Thunder. The stallion moved like he'd been born for warfare, anticipating gunfire, dodging between trees, using terrain to maximum advantage. Wright's men were starting to break. These were professionals, but they'd been hired to intimidate and murder a broken-down drunk, not to fight a mounted warrior who seemed to have stepped out of some frontier legend. When two more of their number went down to Eli's accurate shooting, the remainder began to lose their stomach for the fight. "Hold your positions," Wright ordered, but his voice carried a note of desperation that even his hired guns could hear. Thunder charged directly at Wright himself, his dark eyes blazing with recognition and rage. The stallion remembered this man, remembered the smell of blood and gunpowder that had surrounded Martinez's death. This was personal now, a settling of accounts that had been 3 years in the making. Wright's horse reared in terror as Thunder approached, throwing its rider hard to the ground. Wright rolled away, trying to bring his pistol to bear. But Thunder was too close, too fast. The stallion's hooves struck the earth inches from Wright's head, a deliberate near-miss that spoke of controlled fury rather than wild rage. Thunder could have crushed the man's skull easily, but instead he chose to pin him, to hold him helpless while Eli dealt with the remaining threats. "Please," Wright gasped, staring up at the massive stallion who stood over him like an avenging angel. "I can pay you. Whatever you want." "You can't pay for Martinez," Eli said quietly, his gun trained on Wright's chest. "You can't pay for the years Thunder spent running wild because you murdered his master. Some debts can only be settled one way." The broken bridle lay twisted in the dirt where Thunder had thrown it, the leather straps that had once bound and controlled him now destroyed beyond repair. It was a fitting symbol, Eli thought, as he looked down at Wright, pinned beneath Thunder's massive frame. The remaining gunmen had scattered when they saw their employer helpless, more interested in preserving their own skins than collecting payment from a dead man. The clearing was quiet now, except for the sound of Wright's labored breathing and Thunder's satisfied snorts. "Get him off me," Wright gasped, his face pale with pain and terror. "I'll double whatever you're being paid." "Nobody's paying me," Eli replied, dismounting slowly while keeping his gun trained on Wright. This is about justice, something you wouldn't understand. Thunder stepped back at Eli's gentle command, but he remained close, ready to act if Wright tried anything foolish. The stallion's dark eyes never left the man who'd been responsible for so much pain and suffering. Wright struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. "You can't prove anything," he said, trying to summon his old arrogance. "It's your word against mine, and I've got connections all the way to the territorial capital." "Had connections," Eli corrected. "Past tense." The sound of approaching riders interrupted Wright's confusion. But these weren't more hired guns. Doc Henley led a small group of townspeople, including Mayor Caldwell and the territorial inspector who'd visited weeks earlier. Behind them rode a man Eli didn't recognize, wearing a badge that caught the morning light. Deputy Marshal Carson. The stranger introduced himself, dismounting near the group. "Territorial authorities sent me to investigate reports of irregularities in land deals and mining claims." Wright's face went ashen. "This is a private matter." "Murder's never a private matter," Carson interrupted, "especially when we've got witnesses coming forward." Doc Henley stepped forward, holding a leather satchel. "Found this among Wright's papers when we searched his ranch this morning. Seems he kept detailed records of his business dealings, including payments to men for claim adjustment services." The deputy marshal took the satchel and began examining its contents. Carlos Martinez, shot while fleeing claim jumpers. Payment of $50 to Jake Morrison for services rendered. He looked up at Wright. "Morrison's in custody, by the way. Very talkative fellow once he realized he was facing the gallows." Wright's carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him, and everyone present could see it in his eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "You don't understand," Wright said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "This territory was lawless when I came here. Someone had to bring order, had to make the hard decisions, like murdering miners for their claims." Eli asked quietly, "Like building something lasting?" Wright snapped, his mask slipping completely. "Do you think civilization comes without cost? Do you think progress happens by asking nicely?" Thunder stepped forward, his ears pinned back, responding to the anger in Wright's voice. The stallion remembered this tone, remembered the last time he'd heard Wright speak with such cold calculation. "Easy, Thunder," Eli said softly. "He's not worth it." But Wright made a fatal mistake. Seeing Thunder's approach, he reached for a hideout gun tucked into his boot. The movement was quick, desperate, the action of a man with nothing left to lose. Thunder's response was quicker. The stallion reared up on his hind legs and struck out with hooves that had carried him through 3 years of wilderness survival. Wright's gun went flying as the man was knocked backward, landing hard against a boulder with a sound that echoed across the clearing. When the dust settled, Wright lay motionless, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The man who'd terrorized miners and stolen land through murder and intimidation was finally still. "Self-defense," Deputy Marshal Carson observed matter-of-factly. "Man was drawing on an officer of the law." Eli holstered his gun and moved to Thunder's side. The stallion was breathing hard, his eyes bright with the aftermath of violence, but there was something different in his expression now. The rage that had defined him since Martinez's death was gone, replaced by something approaching peace. "It's over," Eli whispered, his hand resting on Thunder's neck. "He can't hurt anyone else." Thunder lowered his great head and nuzzled Eli's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke of bonds forged in shared struggle. The horse that had been branded a killer was finally free to be what he'd always been, a loyal companion who protected those he loved. Doc Henley approached with a smile on his weathered face. "Seems like that horse of yours has quite a sense of justice." "He always did," Eli replied. "Just took the right circumstances to show it." Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat nervously. "About Wright's property, his ranch, his holdings, will be sorted out by the territorial court," Deputy Marshal Carson interrupted. "Along with compensation for his victims. Should be enough to keep several families comfortable for years to come." As the officials prepared to remove Wright's body and begin the process of unraveling his criminal empire, Eli found himself alone with Thunder in the clearing where it had all ended. The stallion stood quietly beside him, no longer the wild, rage-filled animal from the auction ring, but not yet the fully domesticated horse he might become. Somewhere between those two extremes, Eli realized, was exactly where they both belonged. The new brand iron bore the intertwined letters E and T, custom forged by Henrik the blacksmith, with the kind of care reserved for special occasions. It wasn't for marking ownership, Eli had explained. It was for marking partnership. The permanent bond between two souls who'd found each other again after traveling separate roads through darkness. 6 months had passed since Wright's death, and the valley had settled into a new rhythm. The territorial court had indeed awarded compensation to Wright's victims, including a substantial settlement that allowed Eli to rebuild his cabin properly, with solid walls and a sound roof that would keep out the mountain winters. But more than that, it had given him the resources to pursue something he'd never imagined possible, a life worth living again. Thunder stood in the pasture behind the cabin, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun as he watched Eli work with a young mare that had been brought in by Mrs. Patterson. The horse was another broken soul, spooked by rough handling and quick to shy away from human contact. But under Eli's patient guidance, she was learning to trust again. "Easy there, girl," Eli murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used with Thunder during those first difficult days. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The mare, Gentle he'd named her, took a tentative step forward, her ears pricked with cautious interest. She'd been making progress every day, the wildness in her eyes gradually giving way to something approaching peace. It was satisfying work, this business of healing damaged animals. Word had spread throughout the territory about the man who could gentle horses that others had given up on, who understood that some wounds could only be healed with patience and kindness. Clients brought their problem animals from 3 counties away, willing to pay good money for Eli's unique skills. Doc Henley appeared at the pasture fence, his medical bag exchanged for a fishing rod and a wide smile. Retirement suited the old doctor well, though he still made house calls when emergencies arose. "How's she coming along?" he asked, nodding toward Gentle. "Better than expected," Eli replied, not taking his eyes off the mare. "Should be ready to go home by the end of the month." "And Thunder?" Eli glanced toward the big stallion, who was watching the training session with obvious interest. Thunder had appointed himself supervisor of all activities on the property, taking his role as protector and teacher seriously. "Seems to enjoy having students," Eli said with a smile. "Makes him feel useful, I think." It was true. Thunder had taken to the work with enthusiasm, demonstrating proper behavior for the damaged horses, providing reassurance with his calm presence, and occasionally stepping in to correct a student who was being too aggressive or fearful. The stallion understood what they were trying to accomplish here, and he'd become as invested in the success of each animal as Eli was. The afternoon wore on with its comfortable rhythm. Eli worked with Gentle while Thunder supervised, the two of them moving with the kind of coordination that came from deep understanding and shared purpose. When the mare finally allowed Eli to brush her coat without flinching, Thunder whickered approvingly, as if congratulating both student and teacher. As evening approached, Eli put away his tools and walked to the small cemetery he'd established on a hill overlooking the valley. Martha's grave was marked with a simple stone, bearing her name and the dates of her too short life. But the real memorial was the garden that surrounded it, wildflowers she'd loved, planted and tended with the same care she'd once given to their dreams. Thunder followed him up the hill, as he did every evening, and stood quietly while Eli spent a few minutes talking to Martha about the day's events. The progress of the horses, the satisfaction of building something worthwhile. "She would have loved this place," Eli said to Thunder, his voice carrying easily in the mountain air. "The work we're doing, the lives we're changing. She always said broken things could be made whole again if you just knew how to listen to what they needed." Thunder nickeled softly, a sound that might have been agreement or comfort or simply acknowledgement of shared memory. The stallion's dark eyes reflected the last light of the setting sun. bright with intelligence and contentment. Walking back down the hill toward the cabin, Eli reflected on the changes that had transformed his life. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man living on charity and regret, carrying Martha's wedding ring in his pocket like a weight that would drag him down forever. Now he carried the custom brand iron as a symbol of partnership and purpose, of a future built on healing rather than loss. The cabin was warm and welcoming in the evening light, smoke rising from the chimney, windows glowing yellow against the gathering darkness. It was a home again, not just a shelter, filled with the kind of contentment that came from meaningful work and earned rest. Thunder settled in his favorite spot near the back door, where he could keep watch over the valley and the animals in his care. His position allowed him to see anyone approaching long before they reached the cabin. But these days, visitors were more likely to be clients seeking help than enemies looking for trouble. As Eli prepared for sleep, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this place, the mine collapse that had scattered them across the territory, the years of grief and aimless wandering, the auction where they'd found each other again. Every step had been necessary, he realized. Every loss and struggle and moment of despair had led them to exactly where they needed to be. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as endings, he thought. Sometimes you had to lose everything before you could find what really mattered. Outside, Thunder's gentle breathing provided a counterpoint to the night sounds of the mountains, owls calling, wind in the pines, the distant howl of a coyote. These were the sounds of a world at peace, a place where broken souls could heal and wounded hearts could learn to love again. In the morning, there would be horses to train, clients to meet, and the endless, rewarding work of turning fear into trust. But tonight, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on foundations strong enough to last. Eli Boone slept peacefully, and in the pasture outside, Thunder kept watch over their kingdom of second chances.